Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Cuffin. I'm the Head of Architecture for the Department of Culture and Tourism in Abu Dhabi. And with me today is Mikkel Frost, a founding partner from Cebra. Before I go any further and talk about the Masala, which is a small mosque, I'd like to talk about some of the context, culture, and challenges that we set Cebra, just so that you can understand where the project direction originated from. On this slide here, you can see a building on the left-hand slide, which is Qasr Al Hosn. This is the most significant heritage structure in Abu Dhabi, a building that started with a watchtower to guard a potable water source, then evolved into a fort through the pearl trading, and in 1939, through the concessions to find oil, a palace was built around the side of it. It's all of vernacular construction, coral, sea stone. It's built with the sand and seashells of the land, and is orientated deliberately towards Mecca. The bottom wall that you can see there is orientated to direct prayers before the first mosque or masala was built in Abu Dhabi. As you can see here, it's a very imposing structure. It blends in with the landscape, and it is a very arid, hot, humid coastal desert landscape that is around Qasr Al Hosn. And the building always has a very strong relationship with a mosque or a masala, which you can see there to the front of the fort, with the mihrab there guiding prayers towards Mecca. On the counterpoint to the site, you can see a concrete structure just opposite Qasr Al Hosn there. This is a building called the Cultural Foundation Building. It's of Gropius origin. It housed Abu Dhabi's first theatre, first exhibition hall, and first library. And as you can see here, it's a very kind of de-desertification process that's taken place on the site, where it's very green and lush through irrigation. The challenge that we set Cebra was to provide a new unifying landscape between these two buildings that would act as a narrative landscape for Emirati heritage and identity to take place in an annual festival or a public parkscape, and within that parkscape to include a mosque or masala, which is a small place for prayer, a poetic place for prayer that sits between these two buildings and is subservient to the significance of traditional heritage on one side of the site and a modern heritage flagship building on the other side of the site.
So with those two buildings, we decided to divide the site along a desire line connecting two very important adjacent streets of Abu Dhabi. And with that move, we created two areas, one for each of the two buildings. And we reinstated the fort once again as a landmark on a sand field, whereas the Cultural Foundation building was surrounded by trees that will provide shade for the pedestrians in the area. And we also paved that area to emphasize the fact that the Cultural Foundation building is actually aligned with the city grid, contrary to the fort itself. And then along the desire line, we introduced a water feature with varying widths and depths. And around the water feature, we started working with polygonal shapes that we've called Voronoi afterwards. But in fact, they derive from the original coastal desert landscape of Abu Dhabi. With its very distinct color, materiality, and these mud cracks that you see on the right. So basically, it is mud cracks, and that governs the entire design from detail to the very big surfaces on the site. And I think the resemblance here is pretty obvious when you look at this building site photograph, that it literally seems to kind of grow out of the ground. It has the exact same colors and shapes of the original landscape in which it is embedded. So this is the master plan, and essentially what we did, we left the two existing buildings to remain the architectural anchors of the site, and around that we designed a landscape. And it so happens that the landscape is inhabitable, so to speak, or it's a useful landscape, because within that landscape you find a number of facilities. Under it you find parking, you find a food and beverage area, and you also find the mosque that we are talking about today. If you look at the upper right section along the desire line, you can see that the site gradually rises along the desire line and the water feature. First it's flat, then it rises slightly to contain the food and beverage area, and then it culminates with the minaret and the mosque at the very end, at the northeastern corner of the site. And looking at some of these pictures, you will see that it's difficult to actually tell where landscape starts and stops. You can't really see what is a building and what is a landscape. However, the Cultural Foundation building at the background clearly is a piece of architecture, then surrounded at this point by a new magical landscape. And here, once again, you see that the concrete that we chose for the mosala, for the mosque, looks exactly like the sand on the site. Now that it's been brought back to that state, we actually see the very soil in which it comes out from. So here's the plan of the building. It's symmetrical. It has a female path and a male path, and those are pretty much the same. But you should notice here that it's not one building. It's a number of buildings connected with bridges. And each of these little buildings serves a distinct purpose within the ritual of praying and going from your everyday life and to actually going to pray. Another thing that you should note is that this cluster of buildings, it's pushed out into the bigger part of the water feature, and we do that for a number of reasons. First of all, the building is low and subdued, so we do not compete with the Qasr al-Hasan Fort and the Cultural Foundation building. We wanted that to remain the biggest pieces on the site. But once you place it in a reflecting pool, you visually double the height of the building. So that's one reason for the water. Another reason is that when the water starts moving with the wind, the light that bounces back on the building, it makes the concrete almost vibrant. It looks like it's kind of alive. So when you do pass this building, you do understand that it's a special part of the site. You might even understand that this is a religious landscape or building. But it also keeps people away from the building without fencing it, which can be a standoffish kind of thing to do in architecture. This looks open and welcoming, and yet you can't approach the building. It means that the worshippers can pray in peace, which is incredibly important. So when you approach the building, you're kind of searching for the entrance. You pass between these rocks, you pass it between narrow gaps, a landscape, and you're searching for something like you might search within your life or within religion. And when you do find the entrance and you move into the landscape, you'll find an interior version of the exterior landscape, the same shapes, the same materials. This is the female's entrance hall. This is the male's entrance hall. And essentially, it's just a public covered plaza. This is where you meet and talk to people before and after prayer. When you move on, you pass through a glass tunnel that is bridging over gaps of water. And that, of course, has a purifying, a mentally purifying, symbolic meaning to it. You get ready slowly to pray, and your mood gradually changes. Then you reach the ablution, still the same materials, a little bit of Omani limestone with the concrete, but still the same architecture, the same materials. This is where you get ready to pray, you wash, and then finally you arrive at the prayer hall where the tone and atmosphere changes a little bit. You see the lines on the floor, like any traditional mosque, and it's all lining up towards the Qibla at the end of the space, facing an outside rock with holy inscriptions saying Allah the Great and Merciful. You see the reflected light bouncing back into the space. This is a plan, a suspended ceiling plan showing all of the skylights. It's almost like an inverted kind of landscape hanging down like stalactites. We have two types, one's in concrete and one's in the prayer halls in wood, but they all have suspended light bulbs and actual skylights. It resembles, of course, the night sky. And when you're in the prayer hall, when you look up into these wooden skylights, you'll realize that they're clad with glossy copper, creating an infinite space. It's almost like looking out into the universe through a keyhole, and it's both magical and humbling. But even though it might make you small, it also makes you understand that you are part of something bigger with the religion and with the building. And that's the entire essence of this building and the entire site, not only linking it to the culture, the heritage, and the climate of Abu Dhabi, but also making a scheme where the really big surfaces, the really big mud crack shapes are refound within the detail of the building. It's almost like a fractal way of thinking. Within the microcosmos, you see the macrocosmos and vice versa. For us, this symbolizes the fact that religion is about making meaning in life, and that is what the project does as well. Thank you.
People coming to here, are they coming to pray or just to see the building?
They can do both.
Nice landscape.
It's a really good question. I've been lurking around.
Are there people praying in this building?
Yes, there are. I've been lurking around the site, shooting all of the photographs that you saw.
Yeah.
So I'm there for hours. I know exactly who comes and goes, and it's really fun because it's a very open building. You can't just go in there and sit in the shade and send a text message and leave. Or if you're interested in architecture, you can go and take a picture. But you'll also see people praying. And it happens at certain times of the day. And when the people are praying, then as a visitor, you do understand you're imposing. And you wouldn't go in there. But then when the prayer is over, different kinds of people are coming in, tourists, children, all sorts of visitors, yeah.
My initial impression of what the site was like before was that it was very clearly green. There was a lot of landscaping. And now what I see, I don't see much landscape. Tell us about that decision.
Okay. When we started the project, we undertook a full conservation management plan on both of the significant buildings, traditional heritage, modern heritage, and on all the site itself and its relating facades across the street. The conservation management plan looked to tell the narrative of the fort, first of all, and the fort obviously was not set in a forest of trees, it was set in a coastal desert landscape, and the conservation management and its policies wanted to communicate to the visitors how this building was a vernacular structure. It was built with the material of the land, it was made with crushed seashells and sand, coral stone, and so that the landscape around the fort would talk back to the fort. Around the Cultural Foundation building, we do have a lot of palm trees and planting. So you've got a planting scheme around the Cultural Foundation building, which follows a Cartesian grid of the city, very much on a kind of orthogonal 0 and 90-degree axis, whereas around the fort, we wanted things to be far more organic. So it was about giving both the buildings their original sense of context, one dating back to the 1760s, the first arrival on the island and the watchtower, and the other one dating back to the sort of late 1970s, early 80s, where the modern metropolis of Abu Dhabi took this grid-like city pattern.
And then there's another important point, because when we started working out in Abu Dhabi, when we did park and landscape, it would have to be very green. But the problem is that you need a lot of water with irrigation, otherwise the plants will die. So we've been searching for a sustainable landscape that is more natural in this climate. So we look to use native plants, but also fewer plants that are closer to sort of a desert type of park. So it is a park and it is a landscape, but it's not a British lush green place anymore. And I think we've succeeded in kind of turning around the idea of what a park can be in a climate like this.
And also to that as well, within Abu Dhabi, we have a governing system called Estidama, which is very much like LEED, and it deals with sustainability. And we have to have a certain percentage of shading on the site, as well as water uses and the use of indigenous material and localized kind of gathering of products, etc. So it all falls within that kind of guidance.
I think that's where my question was coming from, was it felt like a very shady, cool oasis of a place in the initial images, and now it looks like it's very, very much more exposed.
Yes.
And very hot.
Yes.
As a public space, right?
No, as I say, we have got around the fort. Obviously, if you want to walk in 50 degrees heat in the middle of June, July and August, you will get hot. But there are shaded pathways around the site. There's a deliberate pathway actually through, which is part of the city kind of manifesto for planning, which is called the Shaded Way, which deliberately moves across the island and provides you with a shaded path beyond this site and into the kind of narrowness of the buildings as well. So, yes, you're right. If you want to walk in the desert heat and feel what it was like back in the day, which is again part of the concept of the delivery of the fort element of the site, it is hot. But there are areas of shading connecting to where the public car parking pops up from below ground that will give you shaded routes through the palm groves to the entranceways of the building.
So that little diagram, number 2 from the top on the left column, that is showing where we have all the plants on the site. This is the components of the master plan broken down into separate systems, so you can actually see all of the buildings, the desire lines, the paths, and the water features, etc.
What you also have to think about as well is with the planting that was on the site when it was extremely green, coral stone, by its very nature, is a porous material, and that was absorbing a lot of the groundwater back up into the building and damaging the fabric. So this now, putting the building back in the kind of natural territory that it was used to, is also safeguarding that structure.
So just to extend that point and clarify, are you saying that you have sand around the mosque now?
No, not around the mosque. We were talking about the barrenness of the site around the fort area. So basically, the conservation management plan determined that there was a buffer zone around the fort, which you may be able to see on that diagram there, where it's the lighter beige color. So that's the sanded area. The darker beige colors are kind of concrete pathways around the site, but the masala is in a kind of concrete paved, in situ cast concrete area.
Well, that's part of what also interests me. Traditionally, mosques have been not just objects, but objects sitting in courtyards or after courtyards, or after a series of courtyards. You have internalized it looks like all of those, that progression from outdoor to indoor. You talked about doing that, but you've internalized all of that and you've removed this from the overall square, right? Even the fort is a courtyard structure. This is very much a fractured object. And again, I'm not even sure how one enters it, but no shaded courtyard, no semi-outdoor space, no place of ablution that's outside, and then you move inside.
Okay, I mean, first of all, what we've got here is a masala and not a mosque.
Not a full mosque.
We're calling it a mosque basically to try and help people understand the religious context
Understood.
of it.
So, yes,
okay,
understood.
so that's one point. That's not a problem. We can still answer your questions. Mosques do have a courtyard outside of them, which is called the San, which is where ablution can take place. This is a slightly different take on that one because, as I say, it is a masala. We have the courtyard is almost the entrance hall in a way. It's not open to the elements in a kind of full open to air, but it does take the precedent of a courtyard or a reception hall before you go through into ablution and before you go into the prayer halls as well. The other thing that we've taken into account here with the fractured nature of the building is there was a mosque on the site before. When that mosque is removed, we're dictated to by a religious guiding body or religious authority that a mosque of a similar size or bigger must be built on the site. With the Conservation Management Plan dictating that the two significant buildings on the site must be the fort and the Cultural Foundation building, we had a real struggle in the early planning stages of trying to find a way of putting a building of that dictatorial size on the site without competing with the massing of the two significant buildings on the site, which is wherein the kind of shattered geometric massing of this building is now and how you can see it. What we also did with this kind of play on nature with the Voronoi shape is look to the early morphology of Abu Dhabi settlement, where all the settlement houses were built very, very close to one another to generate two things called Sika and San, which is an alleyway and a courtyard space. And by building those structures close together, they channel the breeze through the building to provide natural coof to their neighbours and to the structure themselves. So by us putting the glass bridges in those areas, we also channel the breeze through those to provide natural cooling to what would be the more thermally exposed areas of the fabric.
Can you just point out where that courtyard, where that entrance hall is?
Yeah.
Where is it on this?
I don't know if this works actually. It's very weak. Can you see it?
Yeah,
So you'd walk in here, the female.
I see. And then, and there in the male hall, and then
These would
towards.
actually be equivalent to outdoor courtyards in a way because you have more volumes out here. So you do feel that you're in a defined space when you're in this area.
Okay.
And these are the bridges connecting, of course. And they're all protected because they're in the shade, so they're not overheated.
Could you walk us through when you enter? What are the rituals of elements?
Yes, of course.
Yeah,
So this is the female entrance hall.
yeah.
So, let's see if I can point all the way to the screen from here at this angle. Okay, so this is the passage where you walk in through to the entrance hall here. And then you have a chance to go to the ablution, get ready and wash your hands and feet before you pray. Then you go back into the prayer hall here. And those are the 3 steps, then you walk back out. All of these are support facilities for the building, technical facilities, these ones. And the male is actually mirrored. You have the entrance hall here. This is the ablution space. This is the prayer hall.
So
This is the ablution space.
So you walk toward the ablution, back out to the entrance, and then into the masala.
Yes, and there are 2 ways to do it. You can actually walk through the ablution directly from the ablution into the prayer hall, or you can do the other version. There are different opinions on that. We decided on this solution after a number of iterations. We actually did have the other solution before.
Could you talk a little bit about your use of water here? Because you described it in very formal terms about the scale of the building. And if you are sort of looking back at the desert landscape, there would be different degrees of wetness over here. And it seems the pools are more mirror pools than actually working with any of the vegetation or gathering. So I'm just wondering, is there a systemic relationship to how the water is here? Or is it more, like the paving, another effect?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I'll start, and if I miss something, I'm sure you'll catch it. Basically, as I mentioned before, the site was a narrative landscape to talk about Emirati heritage and identity. This site, first of all, was started with a finding of a potable water source, which is where there was a watchtower, and the water table actually is only about 700 millimeters below the surface. So it's a very shallow water surface. Around Abu Dhabi Island, there's things called khors, which are the creeks which go through the site, and that's what SEBRA used to basically use as a defining line between the traditional side of the site and the modern heritage side of the site. But also we have festivals that take place on this site on a regular basis, and there's a very rich maritime heritage with Abu Dhabi, from the pearling industry and fishing, etc. So we wanted a water feature that would be on the site to be able to reenact and to utilize for that celebration on an annual basis. But the water we have on the site is very shallow. It's not deep pools that we've put on there, and it gets topped up should it start to evaporate on the site. But we've been scarce with the use of water because we know from a sustainability point of view we couldn't be lavish with its use, but it's there more for a narrative than anything else.
So it doesn't play a role in the planting system, which is on the other side.
There's a rule in the planting
system? Like very often water is collected and it's redirected.
Yeah, we do have grey water systems on the site, and all the irrigation is on timers as well. But going back to what Mikkel says, we chose plants which are all indigenous to the region. So we've got things like aloe vera or fountain grass, things like that, which do not need as much kind of irrigation as you would if you went for kind of sort of Western plants on the site.
Fascinating project. Thank you very much.
There's the block. Let's hold it together.
Thank you. Oh, we've got to move over.
Oh, yeah. Over here. Yeah. Back again.